I'm standing in front of a portrait of our namesake, Charles Perkins, Dr. Charles Perkins AO, the first Aboriginal man to get a degree from the University of Sydney. And I had the very good fortune a couple of nights ago to hear Rachel give the Charles Perkins Centre oration up in the Great Hall. And I would urge anybody who wasn't there, at least, to listen to it. It's on iView on the 23rd of September. And with that, I'd like to pay my respects not only to Charles as our role model and namesake, but also to the traditional owners of the land upon which this building is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, elders past, present, emerging, and any First Nations people with us here this evening. The Nicholas Catchlove Lecture is an annual event, and it's in recognition of and in memoriam to Nicholas Catchlove. And Nick, as he was called, is the son of Barry Catchlove and the sister of Penelope Catchlove. Penelope's with us here this evening. Barry and Professor Louise Sylvan, his wife, are travelling and are looking forward to the recording of this event. They're not with us this evening. But the Catchlove family have supported some really significant events in this building. They have supported not only the annual lecture in honour of Nicholas Catchlove, but also the Nicholas Catchlove Early Career Development Fund, which supports our early career researchers in the building, which in many ways, that group are the beating heart of our project here, which is a highly multidisciplinary attempt to bring together people across many disciplines to address the burden of chronic disease in this country and internationally. And it's due to the generosity of the Catchlove family that we've been able, for example, to see 130 summer scholars come into the work of the centre, many of whom have gone on to do their PhDs and leave to Cambridge, to Harvard and other really distinguished international research institutions. And that's been made possible by their generosity. But it's also given us access to an extraordinary series of speakers and the opportunity each year to celebrate Nicholas's life in an event. And I guess the prevailing theme of those events is that they're supposed to try and convey the complexity of health and medicine in a way that's accessible to a general audience. And this evening, we're taking the telling of complex stories accessibly to a whole new level. And we're going to do that by integrating the Catchlove with the Harris. So we have in the Charles Perkins Centre a really, I think, remarkable series of writers who have joined us, thanks to Judy Harris, who's sitting here in the front row, and the Writer in Residency, which happens again annually. What we do here is bring from a very distinguished crowd of applicants a single writer to come into the work of the centre and to spend a year here in the creation of a major work. Their task is twofold. One is to write that major work and to have it shaped by the experience of being here. And in turn, they're supposed to leave an impression on us, the way that we do our work and the way that we tell our stories as researchers, as scientists, as clinicians, and as humanities researchers, because you'll find them all here. And that program has seen a really wonderful series of writers. We began with Charlotte Wood, then Alana Valentine, Mairead Shaw, Emily Maguire, Tracy Sorensen, Sarah Holland-Batt, and this year Lech Blaine. And as a result of their activities here, we've celebrated the launch of Charlotte's novel, The Weekend. Latterly, that's been adapted for the stage at the Belvoir. Alana Valentine's play, Made to Measure, Emily Maguire's novel Love Objects, and most recently, Tracy Sorensen's really extraordinary cancer memoir, The Vitals. So what we're going to do this evening is to try and demonstrate how putting creative writers and our researchers together actually works. And to do that, we've got two pairs, a writer and a researcher, and I'm going to introduce those two pairs one at a time. Each will speak for 5 to 8 minutes, and after both pairs have spoken, then we'll sit down and enter a discussion, and that discussion will go for as long as we've got interesting things to talk about. But I promise you it won't go any longer than just before 7 o'clock. Now, I'm going to join that discussion in part because that's my role. I'm supposed to guide the discussion, but I'm also here with my own story, and colleague David Robenheimer, who's sitting in the audience here, he and I have been inspired by having writers in this building to write our own book, and that's a scientific detective story called Eat Like the Animals. So we have some experience as researchers of what it means to listen to and be surrounded by creative writers of extreme quality. So that's what we're going to try and do. At the end of that, there will be nibbles, there will be drinks, and even an opportunity, thanks to Glee Books, to have some books signed. So that's the nature of this evening. So with that, please let me introduce our first pair. Our first writer is Professor Sarah Holland-Batt, who I'm sure you all know is an award-winning poet, editor, critic, and academic, and the author of 3 books of poems, most recently The Jaguar, which won the 2023 Stella Prize, and just very recently the 2023 Queensland Premier's Award for a work of state significance. She's also written a book of essays, Fishing for Lightning, a collection of her columns on contemporary Australian poetry written for The Australian. She was educated at New York University and the University of Queensland. She's a recipient of a Sidney Myer Creative Fellowship, the W.G. Walker Memorial Fulbright Scholarship, residencies at Yaddo and MacDowell colonies in the US, and an Australian Council Literature residency at the B.R. Whiting Studio in Rome, among many other honours. And, as I said, she was also a Judy Harris Writer in Resident here in 2022. And she's currently Professor of Poetry at QUT in Queensland, and we forgive her for that. Paired with Sarah is Dr. Janani Thillainadesan, and Janani is a staff specialist geriatrician at Concord Hospital, an early career researcher at the Centre for Education and Research on Ageing, also at Concord, and a conjoint senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. Janani was recipient of an NHMRC, that's the National Health and Medical Research Council, postgraduate scholarship, and I think really significantly, her PhD work has culminated in the implementation and evaluation of a novel geriatric co-management model of care, which actually works. The evidence she collected during her PhD indicates that it actually does work, and that's brilliant translation into the real world. So she was awarded the Australian and New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine 2021 Career Investigator Prize, and she's now leading a research program that's focused on medical education for junior doctors and junior doctors in hospitals dealing with geriatric patients. She was awarded the 2023 Royal Australasian College of Physicians Vincent Fairfax Research Fellowship to establish that program. So please, Janani and Sarah, would you come to the stage one at a time? We're going to begin with Sarah. So please welcome Sarah Holland-Batt.
Thank you very much, Steve, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge the Catchlove family and Judy Harris, particularly for the amazing role that she's made for so many writers and such a legacy for Australian literature here. I'd like to start with a reflection on a day that I had early on in my Perkins residency, where the wonderful David Lakuta gave me a tour of Concord Hospital, and he introduced me to his colleague Janani, who's going to be joining us this evening. And Janani took me on a tour of a ward called Ward 17 at Concord Hospital, and this is a locked ward for patients with dementia and with behavioural problems that come along with dementia. And it's an environment that's not unfamiliar to me. My father had Parkinson's for 20 years. He experienced dementia, including behavioural issues in his illness. But I was struck, so it should have been familiar, and I was struck walking through the halls, in fact, by how estranging and confronting I found that environment when there wasn't someone I knew and loved in there, because this was a familiar environment and yet also one that felt confronting to me. And it made me sort of think about this issue of how we get to know and value older people, particularly when they have cognitive decline, particularly when their behaviours are sometimes challenging, sometimes difficult. And that's the sort of topic that's preoccupied me in my work in a range of ways, and I just want to touch on a few of those with you this evening. The subject first came to me, as I indicated, through my dad's experience. It wasn't a topic that I thought I'd end up writing about a lot, but Dad had Parkinson's, he had dementia, and during his illness, I learnt a lot about what that means. I had assumed, like most people, I think, that Parkinson's and dementia meant a slow progressive loss of the self, that the person that you knew was disappearing. And in a way, that was the way I experienced, but I was also quite surprised with Dad's illness at how often his life narrative interacted with the way his dementia and behavioural issues presented themselves. And so Dad had lived in England during the war. He lost his father during World War II. And when he was experiencing some of those challenging things that come along with Parkinson's disease, like delirium, like hallucinations, pathological crying, often they were prompted by things that had happened or related to his past. So one of the touchstones for Dad was any mention of Winston Churchill would set him crying. Any mention of World War II would set him crying. And often when he had sort of delirium in the night, the hallucinations that he had were related to World War II. And it struck me that I understood and knew that, because that I knew Dad's story and I could understand and, in a way, empathise with the way those behaviours were presenting them. But it also struck me that a lot of the caring staff in his nursing home didn't know my dad's story, didn't know perhaps why he was crying or what this was all about, and the difference that made when you do know someone's personal narrative and story in the kind of care that you're able to give. And it was my experience with Dad that if I knew that he was talking about Winston Churchill, I'd find a path to weave him back to the present, because I knew where he was and that was his story. Whereas to the staff, Dad almost had no past. He was Tony. People knew that he had a daughter. They knew that he had a wife, but they didn't know his history. They didn't know about his father. They didn't know about his childhood, and that also had implications for his care. And so this question of how to privilege and prioritise the voice of older people and their stories, and to recognise the clinical value that these things have in achieving improved care, is an issue that sort of interested me from a range of angles. Principally, of course, I'm a poet, so I've written about Dad's experiences in my most recent book, The Jaguar. But when I was at the Perkins Centre, I had the good fortune to work with a really wonderful geriatrician called Dr. Sue Ogle, who some people in the room may know. And Sue led a really wonderful workshop for junior geriatricians at the Royal North Shore Hospital with me, where we shared Dad's clinical history, but also I told anecdotes and stories and poems about how that clinical history felt from a carer's perspective, from a familial perspective. And together in that workshop, I think we told two stories that often run on parallel tracks that don't often intersect, or they might intersect occasionally when you go in for a meeting at the doctor's office, but more often than not, the experiences of carers and the experiences of I suppose, those who are giving the care run on parallel tracks. And as I know Janani has also explored in her research, closing that gulf between those two types of narratives will enhance care and will enhance engagement between medical staff, patients and carers. So there's an important role for narrative and story to be played, I think, in the care of older people in particular. During my time at the Perkins Centre, in addition to undertaking work on a book that's still in progress, I was also continuing some more traditional research with some colleagues on a discovery project, looking at how arts-based methods, so things like poetry and storytelling, may be used to amplify the voices of older people in care. And I wanted to share a few examples of that with you really briefly, just to set the scene. This kind of arts-based research is different from the literary poetry that I write myself, where I'm using imagination to kind of create an alternative way of seeing the world. It uses the older person's words themselves. So through interviews, we create transcripts where they talk about their lives, and then we come in and help them condense those into poems. And those poems might be displayed on an aged care resident's door to their room. They might be published. They might be shared with the outside world. For carers in that space, that offers a little conduit into their life, into who they are, who their family, what their family history is, what their hopes and aspirations may be. And also it's our intent that those stories also help break the stigmatisation and the isolation of older people in care whose stories aren't often shared with the outside world as well. We've also used a methodology called photo voice, which is a similar kind of thing. You give people in aged care a disposable camera and they can photograph things that give them joy in their day, things that they find challenging in their day, and display those images to show a sense of their story, their perspective to those who care for them, but also to the general community as well. I'm aware that I've got 8 minutes, so I'm going to bring it in now and just close, I suppose, with a cautionary note, because I think we like to sort of tout the value of storytelling and the power of narrative, and it almost always is a positive thing. But we've also done research into media representations of older people through the Royal Commission, through that period, through print media, so newspapers, and I just wanted to share just a few of the statistics that we've gleaned through that analysis to suggest that just as narratives can be empowering and prioritise and privilege the voice of older people, so too can they contribute to the stigmatisation and dehumanisation of older people. So we looked at visual representation of older people, so put simply, the photos that go in the paper accompanying news stories about aged care. And we also looked at sourcing practices, so put simply, who's asked for comment in newspaper stories. We found that in the news stories in print media of coverage of the Royal Commission, that older people were presented as disembodied, which means you couldn't see their whole body, you can't see their face, or maybe not even their head, in 67% of all photographs accompanying news coverage of the Royal Commission. The most frequent trope was photos of hands, that is the way that older people are represented in the news. We also found that across print media, older people were overwhelmingly depicted as isolated and alone. So only in 6.4% of all the photographs of the Royal Commission were older people in care presented with a family member, with a loved one. Photojournalists were much more likely to show older people from a higher angle and to depict public servants or politicians from a lower angle, indicating a superior kind of gaze. And most importantly, the individuals who aged care affects the most, that's residents and aged care workers, were the 7th and 8th most popular sources, respectively, that journalists quoted in news stories. Journalists in our sample were 3 times more likely to quote a politician than an aged care resident in stories about aged care. So I hope that maybe sets a little bit of ground for some of the ways we can start thinking about the value of stories, but also the challenges that stories pose in considering how narrative can be helpful, harmful, or somewhere in between for older people in care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And Janani.
Thank you, Steve. And as always, what Sarah has said has left me with a huge impression. So Sarah described through her eyes the reality of Ward 17, which is the dementia care unit at Concord Hospital, where patients with behavioural disturbances secondary to dementia receive multidisciplinary care. So I remember looking after a retired veteran who was also a former professional boxer who was living with severe dementia, and this led to physical aggression towards his wife. And this was a really challenging situation. And then there was the Italian seamstress who, lost in her maze of dementia, would be wandering the streets searching for her children and not understanding why her children haven't returned from school. And so the team listens to the stories of these patients and develops a personalised care plan to support the patients and the carers. But Ward 17 is just one small part of the large healthcare landscape. So in the year 2020 to 2021, out of 1,000 hospital admissions, 8 were for individuals with dementia. So understanding the perspectives and life stories of these older adults is really crucial to provide compassionate, effective and person-centred care. And to achieve this, it is so important to integrate the older patient's voice into research, teaching and their healthcare. So let's talk about clinical research. So older adults are seriously underrepresented in clinical trials. For example, older adults were the hardest hit by COVID-19, yet most clinical trials in COVID-19 excluded patients with common age-related diseases, excluded adults with cognitive problems, and very few allowed families to provide consent. And this exclusion of older adults has serious consequences for clinicians like myself. It means we end up lacking a strong evidence base to tailor treatments for this vulnerable group. So there's room for improvement. So during my PhD, I worked with vascular surgeons who were quite aware of the unique needs of the patients that they were looking after. So we set out to revamp the way we care for older patients undergoing vascular surgery. So I implemented and evaluated a model of care where a geriatrician, which was myself, was embedded within the surgical team to co-care for the older vascular surgery patients. And our model led to better outcomes, including reduced delirium, confusion, and reduced medical complications. And this was benefiting a real-world population with dementia, frailty, and complex care needs. And inclusion of carers and shared decision-making were key components of our approach to care. And this really goes to show that with teamwork and an individualised patient-centred approach and innovation, we can enhance outcomes for older patients and contribute to that evidence base. But it doesn't stop with inclusion. Inclusion is just the beginning. So you've probably heard the term patient-centred care, person-centred care, but what does this really mean in the world of research? Well, older adults value health outcomes differently to younger patients. So we know up to 70% of older adults would not choose treatments that extend their life but reduce their function or cognition or independence. Yet few studies on older patients measured these outcomes. Patients and carers, they want to be heard and they want to be respected during their hospital stay. And this means clinicians need to listen, ask questions, and also act on their preferences and respond to their needs. So to truly understand and to improve the quality of care for older adults, we need to measure patient and carer-reported outcomes, and as well as their experiences. So my research program is looking into this. And patients and carers, they're not just research participants, they are the ultimate consumers of healthcare. So consumer-led research has gained prominence due to patient advocacy groups. And as these groups say, nothing about us without us. So we need to be undertaking research that actively involves patients and their carers in shaping research questions, study design, implementation, and the dissemination of findings. The narratives of older Australians don't just enhance research. These narratives also enrich the way we educate and inspire a generation of compassionate and skilled healthcare professionals who will care for the growing ageing population. So geriatricians like myself bring our specialist knowledge and expertise, playing a crucial role not just in treating the older patient, but also in educating the healthcare workforce about their unique care needs. And this includes our junior doctors, who are often at the forefront of assessing and managing older patients in hospital. So our recent research involved conversations with junior doctors, which highlighted a common challenge they face: caring for patients with dementia-related behavioural and psychological symptoms. So they often found themselves assisting with patients who were wandering off the ward or became physically or verbally aggressive, and they felt overwhelmed and unsure about providing the necessary care in these situations. So medical students and junior doctors, they generally hold positive attitudes towards older people, but they have negative stereotypes, and few express any interest in careers in geriatric medicine. And such perceptions can be influenced by widespread negative stereotypes of older individuals, as revealed in Sarah's recent study on media portrayals of older people. So patient stories can help bridge this gap. So Sarah's poetry, for instance, has been used by geriatricians like Sue Ogle to teach medical students and junior doctors. By sharing these narratives with junior doctors and medical students, we're not just preparing them to provide exceptional care for older people, we're also nurturing the next generation of advocates for change in the care of older people. So we shouldn't only turn to patient and carer stories when things go wrong, like identified by the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety. Patient narratives serve as a constant reminder of the human aspect of healthcare, and they inspire doctors like us to be proactive advocates for positive changes throughout their careers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janani. And that brings us to our second pair of writers, or writer-researcher pairings. And our first of the pair is our new writer-in-residence, and that's Lech Blaine. Now, Lech is an award-winning writer and journalist from Queensland. We seem to have picked Queenslanders for the last couple of years, but having grown up there myself, then I'm perfectly happy with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Lech is author of critically acclaimed book Car Crash, a memoir, and the best-selling quarterly essay Top Blokes. If you want to hear about ScoMo, you should read Top Blokes. Car Crash was shortlisted for the National Biography Award in 2 categories at the Queensland Literary Awards in October 2022. Car Crash was published in North America and the United Kingdom by Greystone Books, and Lech's work has been published in places including Best Australian Essays, Good Weekend, Kill Your Darlings, Mianjin, the Griffith Review, The Guardian and The Monthly. He was an inaugural recipient of a Griffith Review Queensland Writers' Fellowship. In 2019, he was awarded a Brisbane Lord Mayor's Emerging Artist Fellowship, and Lech is our 2023 Judy Harris Writer in Residence, during which he's working on his third book in a narrative non-fiction trilogy, which includes Car Crash. It's going to be about genetics, the legacy of love, and running a 3-star motel in Bundaberg. Now that's Lech, and next he's paired with Professor Greg Neely. Professor Neely is the Professor of Functional Genomics here at the Charles Perkins Centre. And his lab uses functional genomics to find novel human disease genes and pathways that are regulated by those genes. His main interest is in age-related diseases involving the nervous system, including chronic pain, neurodegeneration, and strategies to extend health span and lifespan, but maintaining that balance, getting people to live healthily for longer. The aim of Greg's lab's work is to take some of the really cutting-edge genetic technologies that are able to be turned to the manipulation of some of these genetic pathways to really understand their underpinnings and relationship in these disease processes and biological processes of aging. And so these new genomic technologies are able to not only demonstrate and tinker with the fundamentals of biology, to explain how things work, but potentially also to target the underlying causes of problems in ageing and disease. Now, with that, we're going to call initially Lech to the stage for his 8-minute presentation, followed by Greg. So, welcome, Lech Blaine.
Thank you very much, Steve. I won't go into the motel tonight. You'll have to wait for the book because it's quite a different subject matter than what I will talk about tonight. But yeah, so I grew up in regional Queensland. My parents were publicans and foster carers. So they somehow convinced the social workers that raising a bunch of foster kids in a pub was a totally reasonable thing to do. And my mum had a preternatural fascination with literature and with the written word. She inhaled 6 novels a week while raising anywhere between 6 and 9 kids. And this is probably why I ended up becoming a writer instead of a bartender. There was very little money in Mum's upbringing, or very much kindness. She dedicated her life to protecting the vulnerable, to breaking cycles of child abuse, to not shying away from tough subjects, to being a fortress of love. She hit self-pity for 6, and she approached the world with vulnerability and with wonder. Mum spoke very little about the past. Her mother had suffered a number of nervous breakdowns during my mother's adolescence, and afterwards they'd been quite estranged. So I met my grandmother for the first time when I was 6, when she was on her deathbed. Unbeknownst to me, my grandmother was suffering from a very rare brain disease. It was a wicked mixture of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. My great-grandmother had suffered from the same illness, and there was no cure. Amongst the siblings, my mum spoke of this as the family curse. This made it sound a bit like witchcraft rather than genetics. Mum didn't get tested. Beside her siblings, she didn't tell a single soul. Not even my dad, her husband. We didn't really notice the dramatic changes to Mum's personality. They were slow and they were steady. We blamed them on the stress of being a foster carer and also on the alcohol that my mum used to cope with that stress. When I was 18, Mum suffered her first nervous breakdown. I took her to hospital where her insanity was attributed to drinking and not to genetics. Her condition didn't improve when she gave up drinking. It got worse and worse. This wasn't supposed to be the case. So when I was 21, I took my mum to a neurologist in Brisbane. He diagnosed her with the family curse. It was a gene that she'd been born with, patiently waiting to wreak havoc. That summer, I organised a nursing home admission for my mum. Her decline was dramatic, and the system was woefully designed for dealing with people with conditions that requiring specialist care like she did. The nursing standards had been progressively cut by governments of both types. Mum dwindled away in conditions that were eventually the subject of a royal commission. Sarah Holland-Batt has detailed her experiences with an eloquence and with a bravery that I would have struggled to muster. Brave because there is so much grief and so much shame in not being able to save someone that you love from neglect. Luckily, my sister Hannah was a neuropsychologist. She was one of my mum's great success stories as a foster carer. And she mustered all of her intellectual expertise and moral courage to make the best of a horrific situation. Mum died in 2018, 20 years after the subtle start of her illness, 5 years after it became blatantly obvious to the experts. She was 64 years old. I was in the process of becoming a writer and also an amateur geneticist. For years, I'd feverishly searched Google for news about miracle cures. There are a range of treatments being trialled on both animals and humans, but none were successful at switching off the gene responsible for my mum's illness. Online, there was a lot of excitement building about the potential of something called CRISPR, which I knew absolutely nothing about. Greg Neely will speak about this technology with more expertise than I can. Essentially, human beings had found a way to edit genetics, first in animals, then eventually in people with hereditary medical conditions. There is genuine optimism that doctors will eventually find a way to deactivate the gene responsible for my mother's death, or at the very least tinker with the protein levels in the brain to save it from decay. So to cut a very long story short, this is why I ended up applying for a fellowship at the Charles Perkins Centre. Among other things, I wanted to write about my mum, to strip away the shame and stigma attached to her illness and address the elephant in the corner of the national living room. Our ageing population can't enjoy everlasting tax cuts while also treating the elderly and disabled with basic dignity. Something must give. I also wanted to hope. I needed to hope. I knew all too much about the past. I wanted a glimpse into the future, to see the glass half full. Here I could be at the heartbeat of Australian research into the human body and into the human brain. Thanks to the surreal generosity of Judy Harris, I've been given the time and the space to wade through my own experiences and to call a spade a shovel. To be creative in the wake of pain, this is a great genius of human beings. I want to make a work of art, not a eulogy or a shopping list of horrific events. I hope that it will capture the absolute absurdity of being alive, but also the magic. Tough but vulnerable, with a wry sense of humour, just like Mum. I still live with the pain of what happened, but I'm driven by curiosity, not self-pity. I'm driven by wonder for this remarkable community of experts and researchers. I'm driven by the trust shown in me by Judy and by the judges. I'm driven by the illustrious achievements of those who came before me, but most of all, I'm driven by love. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lech. Greg, Professor Greg Neely.
Oh, wow, that was amazing. I'm like a little goosebumps right now, so it's kind of really hit me. Yeah, so I'm a geneticist, like Steve said. I work in level 5, Charles Perkins Center up there. It's been awesome. I've been here 8 years so far. It's a wonderful environment, and the infrastructure just allows us to be able to do whatever we can think of, really. And there's also lots of support for us to be able to do it beyond just grants. The focus of my lab since around 2003, I've been focused on chronic pain as one of the primary things we're looking at. So in an aging population, there's a lot of chronic pain. and it can't be treated with the current drugs. There's about 70% of patients don't respond to the current drugs, and even the ones that do respond, they respond to, it's like opiates, but they're, there's a problem with that. They're not actually painkillers as much as distraction and giving euphoria. So there's basically a large percentage of our population globally suffering from pain that's untreatable and what increases as we get older. So that's kind of the general reason why we study pain. And also I was interested in the nervous system because it seemed cool to how does the brain work? How does it control our body? How are we human versus animal? It's just like it's an unanswered frontier. So just in general, it's really interesting to work on the nervous system. So the way we kind of address pain isn't through hypothesis as much, so we're not thinking of how it might work and then trying to test it. What we do is we use genetics approaches. So we use population genetics with my friends around the world, and we use genetic screening techniques in labs to try and figure out what are the different knobs that control, turn up or turn down our pain perception, and then how can we change them? How can we turn them the right way and reset the balance? And so we use a bunch of new genetic technologies. A lot of it's DNA sequencing. It's really a big breakthrough, the ability to sequence so much DNA in parallel. So that's from the human genome being sequenced in 2003 to now we can do a human genome in like a week. But it also gives us a lot of power to do experiments where we can then at the end sequence the results. So it's just it gives us an ability to do hypothesis, like to do an experiment with no hypothesis and then just see what the answer is. And so that's kind of why we do it that way, so we don't kind of taint the process and push it the way we want it to do. We just look at what do the genetics tell us. And so sequencing was one really important new technology, but another important new technology is gene editing, so CRISPR gene editing, like mentioned it. But basically, it's part of the bacterial immune system. So bacteria can sense viruses, and then they remember them, and then they kill them with like little DNA scissors. And so researchers took that technology and then just changed it, retrofit it, I guess, for human systems. So now the same thing that evolved to protect bacteria from viruses, now we can use to change any gene in the human genome. And so that gives us the ability to control the human genome. In cells, we can change genes, but also we can change animals. And in China in 2018, a Chinese researcher edited human embryos and made, without international approval, made edited humans. And so basically the whole way through is possible. In Australia, we're not allowed to do that. You can't have an embryo go over 14 days if it's been edited, or you spend 15 years in jail. So we're okay with that kind of stuff, but it's a big world, and that is definitely going on in China. The person went to jail, but now he's out and runs a research institute. So that's part of the future there. But anyway, with CRISPR gene editing, we can use it for discovery research, but we can also use it as therapies. And so what we're doing, and people in my lab are sitting right here, are doing is we're using CRISPR gene editing to turn off pain genes in the spinal cord of someone, say, that's paralyzed and has a terrible, constant shooting pain that can't be treated. We can go in and inject in the CRISPR, and it can basically turn off the genes that are transducing that pain signal. And so we've done that with other systems. We've done that with stem cells in mice, and now we're developing a CRISPR therapy for that. But around the world, people are focused on CRISPR as a therapy as well, and most of the progress has been in organs we can access easiest. So eyes, which sounds scary, but that's actually one of the areas that had the most progress. But also blood is easy because we can take blood out of a patient, then collect their stem cells from the blood stem cells, and then edit them, and then put them back in. And so for diseases like sickle cell anemia and beta thalassemia, those are problems with red blood cells. There's now been, I think, about 80 people that have been treated with CRISPR for this, and 78 of them are permanently cured. And so instead of having these terrible, like the pain is a part of sickle cell anemia, but also blood transfusions and therapies and stuff. Instead of that, now they're just cured. And so in 10 years, that'll be a standard technique for people that have sickle cell anemia and beta thalassemia. Liver is also something we can access because you can go through the blood and the liver filters it, so you can inject CRISPR into the blood and it'll go to the liver and fix liver diseases. And so basically, we know that CRISPR can change disease course and can cure diseases. And what we now need is the ability and the technologies to do some of the harder tissues. So that's what we're working on, the nervous system. We're working on the spinal cord and the brain, and then basically, with people working all around the world, I'm not sure if, I think we'll nail the spinal cord, but other people will develop ways to edit the brain better. But this will allow us to take hereditary diseases and fix them, and also common diseases. That's the other thing. So things like cancer or dementia or just age-related cognitive decline, those things can be treated by changing, not changing the genome forever, but just in the brain. So yeah, that's the kinds of things we're doing. There, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Greg. And now I'd like to invite all of our speakers up to the stage. Well, that was extraordinary, as I expected it to be. And I wonder whether we might consider some of the core themes that emerged out of today. And one of them, of course, is to do with aging, where, and we've seen the intergenerational report, we're an aging population. An aging population is going to place considerable pressures in all sorts of ways, but it also involves individuals. Individuals who, as we age, inevitably become more prone to various problems. Entropy is a terrible thing. And ultimately, we need to think about ways to ease that burden, but also to really change the narrative when it comes to the way that we manage not only those patients as we age and become sick, but also those who look after us. And I was really struck, actually, in Sarah and Janani, your stories about medical students and their patients living essentially in parallel worlds, and how do we bring those parallel worlds together. So was that something that really resonated in your lives during that year together, working together?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that it's going to require, I think, a total shift in thinking in the way that I think we presently treat older people, which is, you go and see the doctor, you basically present with symptoms, and often that's what's treated, and what's maybe not allowed to be told at that point, or there's not much space and time really to get into some of the other sort of ancillary stories of how those things are presenting. And I think that's the stuff that I've done with Sue and the conversations that I've had with Janani about this stuff. I think it's a starting point for where we need to be, which is somewhere quite different, where the story is also considered as part of the treatment plan, that it's not that all older people are not the same, that the way that these things like delirium or Parkinson's or any other kind of illness presents, maybe there are common symptoms, but the personal narrative can actually really affect the way that these things present, or what sets them off, or and so forth. So I don't know that I'm really entirely answering that, Steve, but I think what I'm saying is, I think it's a huge scale change, a shift that's required to actually integrate narrative that doesn't always sit easily in those kinds of interactions. Janani, do you have kind of thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it starts with the conversation we're having today, which is really about the lived experience, and the genuine lived experience is lived experience with disease and illness, which we don't really see being portrayed in the media. And I think that's also the way we talk about ageing. It's always successful ageing or healthy ageing. It's a sort of outcome-based narrative, but it's not really the personal narrative. So I think that's where those stories, literature, the narratives, the photography really help bridge that gap, and maybe helps us face our own inner fears or whatever that is, which is then leading to the negative stereotypes and the way it's influencing our current medical students, the younger generation, the way media did not talk about the hundreds and thousands of older people who are dying from COVID. So I think it starts with sharing those stories to then be able to provide the right therapeutic approach.
So there's a buzzword in medicine at the moment, which is precision medicine, personalised medicine. And those of us, and Greg, I think I'd count you among us in this sense, those of us who work in a building like this often think of that in terms of multi-omics, where you measure everything about the genome of a person and every circulating biochemical in their blood and every bug that lives in their gut, and you take powerful mathematics and you try and make predictions about their prospects for health and how you might mitigate their journey throughout ill health as they get older. But you've hit upon actually the real truth. The fundamental aspect of personalised medicine is actually knowing something about the personal journey of the person and the person themselves. And that for me has really resonated. Personalised medicine needs to start at the stories of the person. Greg, what would you say to that? Because I think we're guilty of this, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, so I haven't checked the numbers recently, but at least a few years ago, the best predictor of disease was family history, as opposed to a sequence that you have, right? And except for a few rare mutations that are super powerful. And so I think our approaches are kind of are giving a personal molecular explanation, but it's not the same as everything put together in physiology and manifesting in disease. You know what I mean? So I think that when we talk about personalized medicine, we're looking for entry points to therapeutically change their state versus
understand them.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And Lech, you were talking about a story that involves a clear genetic substrate, but it was ignored. It was glossed over. It was explained in other ways. It was sort of put back on your mum and your grandmum as somehow a fault in their behaviour, alcohol and what have you.
Yeah, well, it's complicated because I don't think when say my great grandmother would have been suffering it, that they would have necessarily known what it was, that it was a gene. Like, this is something that was discovered later. So yeah, and there's the biggest thing that I learned from that experience, like in terms of the approach to those illnesses, and this is not from the medical side, but from the personal side, from say my mum's perspective, was her own inability to admit that there was a family history of this thing there to her own doctors, because human beings are just incredible at repressing difficult information and not addressing it. And so it, as much as there were things that were missed, like that's, and so I'm not airing any grievances here. Like, that shows how terrified she was about the reality and about how that would affect her in terms of being a foster carer, being a parent, in terms of all different kinds of insurances. And so she, I guess, along with her own terror, probably made like a calculated decision as well about what was the point. There's going to be no cure, which I think is like the wrong approach. I think that the best thing that she could have done would have been to to open up and to address it and to have a community of people around her rather than living in the kind of suffocating shame and kind of fear that knowing that you might get an illness like that would have created for her.
And the thing that both you and Sarah have done, it's a pretty dreadful set of stories we've heard this evening. It's sort of generally depressing.
Apologies, Steve.
And inevitable and depressing. But, Lech, your writing is hilarious. Every time I sit down and listen to Lech, I end up in paroxysms. His stories are just hilarious, and you'll hear about the Bundaberg Motel one day. But you're talking about the bleakest, most difficult subjects. Sarah, on the other hand, the Jaguar, you read a poem on our 10th anniversary event here last year, and I don't think anybody wasn't crying in the room, but moved profoundly in a positive way. And that otherwise everything we say is either techie or dreadful, and and you're able to translate it in ways that are uplifting and fundamentally moving. How do you do it?
Well, I could ask you the same thing about how do you edit genes. I mean, we're very impressed by you, Steve, as well, and Greg. But I think for writers, the challenge is you don't always get to choose your material. Life gives you your material, and you've got to find your own way, I think, to work with it. Sometimes you're able to see the humour in it. I had hilarious instances with Dad, along with all the tragedy. Like, one of the funniest things that happened with Dad, when he was, midway through his Parkinson's, but still able to use the internet. We had that difficult conversation with him about, it's time to give up your driver's licence. And Dad's response to that was to go and buy a vintage Jaguar car on eBay without telling anyone, without asking. It was delivered to the house. And obviously at the time it was a source of great tension. Mum didn't speak to Dad for about 3 weeks. She was so furious. But in time you see the humour. So I think it depends on how close you are to the thing. But I think for writers, the task is to look at stuff, even if it's difficult. The task is to try and summon some language that allows us to see these things afresh. And if I pick up on some of the comments that we've been talking about, we have really shop-worn ways of thinking about ageing. There are a lot of negative stereotypes. There are a lot of taboos about ageing. I get so furious every time I read the paper and I read phrases like silver tsunami, and I think, you realise you're going to get old someday. You feel like shaking journalists and saying, stop using this. Is going to be you one day. You'll be spoken about in this pejorative way. And so I think the writer's task in a way is to refresh our language and to kind of perhaps shift or allow us to see things in renewed ways. So I don't know, that's not really how do you do it, but that's the why, I guess.
And what did he do with the car?
Oh God, he buggered it. He absolutely stuffed it, I think is the technical term. He tinkered with it a lot. And he was an engineer, so he thought he was making improvements, but unfortunately he'd had Parkinson's for 10 years, so the improvements eventually kind of killed the car in the end. We ended up scrapping it, which was probably for the other motorists on the road for the best. Yeah.
And Lech, what would be your response? How do you make us laugh in the bleakest of stories?
I don't know. Life's very funny. It's like, life is a very funny thing, and so often that humour kind of sticks out more. Like, it's not even like a kind of look on the bright side type thing. It's just that in the middle of really crappy situations, the surrealness tends to stick out more because you're sort of going between quite life-defining moments, and then these outrageous things will happen. And so that's just like as a non-fiction writer, and it's the same as with, say, writing about life or, say, writing about politics. It's like I don't even really have to you don't really have to try that hard to make it funny because the people are so outrageous that they sort of deliver their own punchlines, and that you just have to kind of move out of the way and allow them to do it themselves.
Exactly. And Greg, one of the Lech was talking about hope, and in medicine, a lot of hope is placed on the way that we report medical breakthroughs, as if somehow hope is more imminent than it necessarily is. When it comes to, just give us a feel for the pathway between a discovery in the lab with a pair of bacterial scissors snipping a gene and ultimately a therapeutic outcome. What might that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's when you have a standard drug, like just a pill you're going to take, or maybe something that you take IV, it's basically about a 10-year journey, right? And about $1 billion to get it into humans. For something like CRISPR, it's a little bit hard to tell because it's basically almost the same thing and then changed a little bit. So once it's approved for injection, it'll be easier to be approved again. So the regulatory approval role, like a path after the first thing is approved, will be shorter for the second, and third, and fourth. As far as with sickle cell anemia, I mean, part of it is like we have an aging population. And there's not going to be enough resources to keep everyone alive forever, right? Like there's talk of like Silicon Valley billionaires, whatever, investing in life extension stuff, and that's just for them. Like that's not for everyone. That's not for everyone. Like it'd be a long time before that's like available at 7-Eleven. Or Woolies.
What a dreadful prospect that would be.
So there, I took something cheerful and made it
No,
bleak.
that's right. I remember once being on a panel with Australian scientist David Sinclair, and David was telling us how he envisaged a day when 6 generations could sit around the same dinner table, and I sat there thinking, demography ain't going to work. 6 generations sitting around the same dinner table. Yeah, it's not how long we live, it's how well we live, isn't it, of course?
Yeah, but I would say with like, oops, this fell off, and then when I put it back on, now it's like way too loud. With sickle cell anemia, for example, as long it's not that hard a process to cure it, and it's a lifelong illness, and so it's just about a numbers game of the insurers. Is it worth? It's probably like $1 million right now, and it'll probably drop to like 100,000 in a few years.
Yeah.
And then the calculation will be clear that everyone with sickle cell anemia that's in a country that has advanced healthcare will get it, right? And so it's just a matter of like rolling out all these therapies and then getting them, and then it's $1. I mean, one weird thing that, like when I was doing my PhD, my boss was a medical doctor, and he said the government has a number, and because I'm from Canada, so we have, I guess same as here, but a public healthcare system, but the government has a number, and that's what your life is worth. And so if the amount of medical interventions you need is higher than that number, then they don't do it, right? Otherwise, everyone would get scans every month for cancer or whatever, right? And so it is about money at the end of the day.
Ultimately,
as well.
it has to be. Yeah. And Janani, one thing that you said, which I thought was really important, is the hierarchy within the medical specialties. So nobody wants to be a geriatrician, and that's profoundly concerning, isn't it? When you've got a workforce that should be growing to meet a massively growing demand. So how do we attract young medical trainees into that specialty?
Yeah, I think that's a really complex problem, but part of what we've touched on is the portrayal of ageing and how we're so remote from it, so from the stories and the narratives, and giving that sort of positive perspective, but also realistic perspective of ageing. And there are reviews around why geriatric medicine is not popular. It's not seen to be a research discipline. It's seen to be too complicated, too much grey zone, problems with communications. So I think there's all of that sort of perceptions again of stereotype perceptions, and there's also need through medical school years and through training, that exposure in talking to older people and having that clinical exposure to sort of reframe those thinking. And now I think it is a complex question, and even talking about clinical trials and talk about sickle cell and chronic pain, a lot of the patients in these trials, they are older patients, so there's all these opportunities to get a better understanding of ageing, even in these disease-targeted trials as well. So I think when you think about ageing, it's so much richer than you can perceive through narratives, through research, through science, and I think it's about getting that conversation out there and shown.
And one of the, and I think this is a point we might end on, through having the opportunity to work with colleagues here, one of the really positive things about ageing as a discipline, as a biological phenomenon, is that the biology of ageing is the biology of health. And you start ageing before you're even conceived, and that's because your father's and your mother's, but equally your father's, lifestyle impacts the genetic inheritance that he passes on. The genes that are switched on and off, even in his own sperm, are impacted by his own lifestyle. And they set the developing embryo on a trajectory throughout life. And that trajectory could lead to accelerated or slowed aging with all of the associated diseases that come with it. So in many ways, understanding the fundamental common biology of ageing, if we understood that, and if we understand it across the life course, you for free get cures and understanding for just about every chronic disease, and even your risks of dying of infections. And you can change those trajectories if you understand the lifestyle interventions and the therapies that can push you into a different and better trajectory throughout life. So we should think of aging as beginning in your father's sperm, and if you take that view and the common biology of aging and health and disease,
I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight.
So does that mean I'm already 50?
You're well and truly 50 already, Greg. Yes. So there is a positive to this, and the end product, if we're able to better manage and understand the individual, to put them all back together again, and to enjoy their stories and to see the bright side, then I think we've got a healthy and better future. So look, with that, please, everybody, let me thank Sarah, Janani, Lech, and Greg. Thank you.